Welcome to the Embracing You podcast with your host, Eric Pothen. We are all on our own unique journey to discovering ourselves. Each episode, I will help you navigate the journey within to reconnect with and discover the innate love you have for yourself. This podcast will cover topics from self-love to eating disorders and body image to mental health and to overall well-being. My goal is to help you honor and embrace yourself so you may live your most authentic life. Let's dive in. Well, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Embracing You podcast. I hope that you all have been doing well and you are ready for an awesome episode today. Today I'm bringing back Tori Wilson, and she was on one of my podcast episodes a couple of months ago, and her and I decided to collaborate a little bit more with one another and do some more interviews with each other. And kind of our thought and intention behind this was to really create, kind of a more candid and safe space for us to be able to talk about eating disorders, body image, and our own recoveries. And you all, this first episode and conversation we were able to have with one another was such a treat, and I cannot wait to hear some feedback from you all with what you think about the flow of these conversations that we have. Like I said, we really just want to make these conversations a little bit more approachable and realistic, and to just fill you all in on this whole idea that, being in recovery is an active process. So I'm not going to say too much else, but without further ado, let's dive in. Well, hello, Tori. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me, Eric. I'm so happy to be here.
Absolutely. And thanks for coming back on. And I'm super excited that, today we're kicking off this kind of newer collaboration on my podcast that we've been talking about here for a little bit. And so I'm very excited to kind of introduce this to our audiences and to talk about some really important topics once again within the space of eating disorders.
Yeah, and I'm so happy because it's NETA week. So it's just like it's a really cool opportunity, I think, to just meet and talk a little bit more about awareness and some of the stuff we've gone through.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had just mentioned it is National Eating Disorder Awareness Week. And so to start, just our conversation off with one another, what is one thing that you wish that everyone knew about eating disorders?
It's a really good question. I would say just the fact that it's not like a body physical illness, it is truly a mental illness. And you can't tell by what someone looks like if they're struggling or not. Um, Especially like through the recovery process, I just want to encourage people as well. Like a lot of times, the first thing you do is experience weight gain, and you are allowed to struggle in all different sizes and shapes of bodies because, again, this is like a mentally healing process. It's not a physical one. So, that is, I don't know, something I really, really want people to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's been a lot of percentages on my own Instagram feed this week with it being Eating Disorder Awareness Week. And I think the percentage I saw was that, of those that struggle with an eating disorder, I think it was 6% are considered underweight. So I think that like really aligns with your point and what you wish people knew about eating disorders is that they don't necessarily have a look, and you can be at any weight in the recovery process and people might not be able to know because of your weight. And we shouldn't just assume status based on weight. So I think for me, one thing that I wish that people knew was that, eating disorders aren't a choice. And I had made a post about this recently. And I feel like, there is this language out there where people who aren't living with an eating disorder are interacting with someone who is living with an eating disorder is under this assumption that we made this choice or decision to develop our eating disorder and to be living with our eating disorder. And I really think if even if I were to ask you or anyone else who has lived with an eating disorder that when they were truly in the depths of struggling with it, that they would have chosen to be in that spot, right? Where it's like when you are the lowest of lows, you want nothing else but to be out of that space. And so it's not a choice. It's biopsychosocial, where there are all of these other things that are contributing to the onset of your eating disorder, um, and that when we develop it, like it really is out of our hands, and it's kind of that perfect storm brewing, and a lot of the times it develops without us even necessarily knowing it and being able to cognize and acknowledge it.
Yeah. No, that's so well said. Like everything you just said, I want to bottle that up and like hold that and educate people because you explained it like so perfectly. And a lot of times I actually saw a post. I think it was from Growth with Sophia. I really like her. She went to the same treatment facility I did, Bellator, and she posted something that said a lot of people think an eating disorder is half of a mind illness and half of a body illness, and it showed like a piece of pie and it was split in half, but then she showed the same piece of pie and it was split into like 10 to 12 pieces, and it showed all of the different things that can contribute, and some of it was like trauma, a life-changing experience, other mental illnesses, like it can be hereditary, genetic, like, and so it was just really helpful, I think, for me even to see that, because in some ways it's great for spreading awareness, but in other ways it's just really awesome to like not feel alone in that and know that like you truly didn't choose that, because I feel like sometimes people forget when they're struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that metaphor or imagery of like thinking about a pie, and there can be all these different slices that contribute to the whole pie. My brain goes to like ice cream toppings, right? Where you have this bowl of ice cream and you have all these toppings on top, which could be some of these other factors that contribute to the onset of an eating disorder. And I'm a mixer inner. I don't let toppings just sit on the top of my ice cream, right? But it's like all of these things can coexist at once that can also lead to the development of an eating disorder. So, I thought we could start off our episodes together talking a little bit about our own recovery journey. And so, I guess, a question I have for you is what have been some recovery wins for you recently?
Okay, I would say just recently being able to enjoy some of the flexibility and spontaneity that comes with recovery. I recently went to like a Galentine's trip with my friends in Minnesota, and I didn't get to choose any of the food there. Like it was all provided by my best friend's family, and there was a lot of cooking. And a lot of it would have been completely outside of my comfort zone in the past. And while it was still like somewhat like anxiety inducing, I guess, for me, it really was so much easier. And I was like, could not even believe that I was in this space, because going back a year from now, like a year ago, I would have never been able to do something like that. And to have my best friend's mom even say something to me, she was like, Tori, I can't believe you're here. I can't believe you're doing this. Like, was just like made me feel so warm inside. I was like, oh my gosh, I actually am making progress and other people notice it too.
That's awesome. Well, congratulations for that. It sounds like you were able to kind of like challenge food rules in a way or something along those lines where, I feel like when people live with EDs, they can create such a rigidity around the type of food that they eat. They need to plan everything out. They need to know exactly what they are going to be eating, and so it sounds like you were able to kind of challenge and break outside of that, to really just allow yourself to experience your Galentine's gathering and enjoy the food and you let food be food. And that's challenging, right? To like not know what you will be eating, but that's also a huge win in recovery. So I want to congratulate you on that.
Thank you. I also want to ask what your win is, because I saw one of your posts the other day that was like a pizza lunch win. And I was like, wait, yay, like that's so cool. But what has been another like win of yours recently?
Yeah, great question. And I've been in recovery for about 4.5 years now, and I feel like I have plateaued. Like I feel very grounded in my recovery, but there are little moments where things come up where I'm like, "Ooh, maybe there's something there that I can still challenge and push and begin to question a little bit more and become curious about." And so the other week I for my job, I went to go do a formal observation and they provided lunch that day and they provided pizza. And I noticed that right away once I saw lunch, coming in that it was pizza and I just got super nervous and anxious. And I began to think and my mind was, well, why are you nervous? Like this is just pizza. But then, like I sat with it a little bit more and then I recognized that I still have a food rule around eating pizza at lunch. Like for me, and it doesn't seem like pizza should be a lunch food. Like in my mind and when I lived with my ED, like that was only a food that you could eat at dinner. And so I was faced with that moment there of, do I just not eat lunch, right? And let ED voice win and let that food rule still be in existence? Or do I sit with that discomfort of challenging this food rule and eating this pizza? And once again, like it seems silly saying it out loud, but that's the reality of like living with ED and being in recovery and that voice that's inside of your head. Like something as small as getting anxious about eating a piece of pizza at lunchtime, to the average person, they wouldn't think a thing of it, right? So I chose to eat the piece of pizza. And was it discomforting a little bit? Yes. And also, I felt like so proud of myself at the end for choosing to engage in that discomfort and challenge food rules. And so after that, it just has really opened my eyes to some other areas that I feel like I'm still noticing, right? Like not like huge emotional distress when it comes to food and eating, but there are some elements where I'm like, ooh, I can be curious about that and begin to challenge more things. So I'd say that was a recent win of mine.
I, oh my gosh, when you explain things, I just want you to know, like, you just explain it so beautifully. And I relate a lot to that. And it just makes me feel a lot less alone because, as a creator who talks a lot about recovery and mental health, sometimes I just feel like I have to be so put together and so like I don't know, just good at recovery. As type A people, we want to be so good at things, and recovery is even one of those things. And so I just noticed like I was getting really hard on myself this week, and like my brain was trying to convince me, like, you're not recovered enough. You're like, you still have some things you can improve in. But like, thank you for that beautiful reminder that like it's okay to still have things to work on. Like now that I'm 9 months into recovery and maybe 5, 10 years into recovery, like it's a continual process. And so I just really appreciate that because I get so hard on myself sometimes. So that was really, really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And like 9 months of being in recovery, like that's amazing. Like I think like sometimes we can get so fixated right on numbers, right? Like ED likes to latch on to numbers. And so I think, when we enter into the space of recovery, like yes, I think it's important for people to know like how long you've been in recovery, but I think what's most important is the outward things that we share and show, like our own learning, our, how we've grown throughout the process, that matters the most. And I think I really want people to know that your recovery journey is your recovery journey and it's just as valid as anyone else's, no matter how long you've been on it, no matter how much you have learned. That is personal. And I believe that you need to celebrate every single thing about your recovery, the good, the bad, the ugly.
I love that. I love that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. So I guess on the other side, you said you kind of had mentioned that you've had a little bit of a challenging week, and I know that you had shared a little bit of like the behind the scenes on your social media page. But would you be willing just to describe the challenge that you faced this week and maybe what you did to help yourself kind of overcome that moment?
Yeah, so honestly, I there it's kind of a combination of things that I think is kind of putting me in a bit of a funk this week. So, I've obviously opened up on social media about like I kind of went through a really tough time as a child 19 years ago, right around this time. Like a really big, trauma in my life, and I think our bodies very much still hold on to that trauma even 19 years later. My body just is kind of in panic mode a little bit right now, just kind of very aware, and I feel very disconnected. And so much of what I did in recovery was trying to connect with myself, trying to be kind to myself. Um and just but no, I did so much like work in self growth and like being kind to myself. And so when these moments pop up where I do feel less connected, I always label it as bad. Like I don't feel super, I don't know, in touch with my body right now. And like it just feels kind of weird. And so I've even noticed like some more thoughts come up, especially around like exercise, which is like I've always had kind of a complicated relationship with exercise throughout having an eating disorder, like specifically around just, always feeling like I had to move. And so it's really interesting how even this past week, I just noticed these like little intrusive thoughts about like, oh, you should go on a walk. Oh, you need to move more. Like just things like that. And so I think initially I was just really judging myself for having these thoughts and like feeling really bad and like I'm not a good enough recovery person to like be experiencing all of these things. But I think in just like talking to my mom, and like I had some different like recovery friends reach out. I also had like some of my like good friends reach out, and it's just really nice to like have all of them support me and remind me that like just because I have thoughts or just because I have feelings doesn't mean, number one, that I have to act on them, but number two, that like I'm failing in any way. And so yeah, I think just allowing myself to have these thoughts, to allow them to be, a little bit louder this week and still not letting those define me, has been a good yet tough experience.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things that I kind of want to highlight from what I heard you saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I am such a firm believer of when life becomes out of balance, I think the ED voice can try to find its way back in very easily. And it's because the ED voice knows that we are in this emotionally ungrounded space, and it looks for any crack or crevice to sneak its way back in. And so I am a firm believer that the more we can become aware of when we find ourselves in these moments of emotional ungroundedness and instability, that we really know that this is an important time for us to rely on all of the tools that are in our toolbox to keep us in that space of recovery in case ED voice comes back in. And it very much so, that's kind of what it sounded like in your own experience of it sneaking back in a little bit and entering in those nuggets about intrusive thoughts. And so, um, yeah, I'm just such a firm believer that like life is truly about being in balance and recognizing when we are not in balance, and really taking intentional action to get ourselves back into that space. And so I just really wanted to highlight that because I think it's something that, it seems so simple at surface level, right? Like be aware of, your mental and emotional stability. But I don't think people take the time to realize just how important that actually is when you're in that space of recovery, right? Because anyone at any point in time in recovery is susceptible to a relapse. And, you know, it's in these moments where we are faced with that, right? Like we can choose to listen, or we can choose to say no and remind ourselves of all of these really beautiful tools that we have in our box. So thank you for sharing your experience with that.
No, thank you. Yeah, and I really like what you said too of like it's all about being in balance, because I totally agree with that. Like the more I feel like tuned in and really in balance in my life, like the less I think ED kind of comes in.
Hmm. And I also love that, you said you really just allowed those thoughts and emotions to exist. And I'm such a firm believer that the more we can allow ourselves to just feel and flow instead of resist, we're able to maneuver those moments a lot easier and we're able to move through them a lot quicker as well. And these thoughts don't become stuck within because we're giving them the time and space in a healthy way, of course, right? Um, and just working with them instead of against them. So I just want to highlight your success with that as well.
Yeah, and I also wanted to hear too. I know we didn't do your low, so what's like I guess a little bit of a low for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like this has been a pretty good week for me in recovery, but I feel like this week in particular, like last weekend on Saturday, I my body just was like, you got to chill. You got to chill. Like I've been stressed with work. I work multiple jobs. I just have a lot of commitments in my life, which I'm very grateful for. And also, my body told me that you got to back off. Like just rest, rest, rest. And so, I've really worked hard to get to the point where I am now of being okay with A, doing nothing, and B, taking more rest days, which have been so important, I think, for me. And so I did lower my levels of physical activity. I did take a rest day, but like even getting myself back into my exercise routine at the gym this week, like I haven't been pushing myself like I normally have. Like actually, on Monday, I decided to end my workout early because my body was like, nope, you're done. And with that, those counteracting thoughts of like, oh, you didn't finish your workout, right? So it's these little things that sneak back in. So once again, there's an example in my life how when I felt out of balance in my physical space, that ED voice tried to come back in and tries to like say I'm not worthy because I did not finish whatever workout I had planned for myself earlier on in the week. So I'd say it was both a challenge and a win, I guess.
I love that though, because a lot of our wins are related to like challenges we face too. And I don't know, I like, even in saying that, I think you helped me see where some of the things that I thought were negatives were actually wins. Like even with working out, like I did a home workout yesterday, which is like very unlike me. I typically go to the gym, and I just like allowed myself to do it with no weights, all body weight, and it was like so fun, and I got a tan. So it was like I don't know, even stuff like that that I wouldn't have done previously. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. You're always so insightful, and you
Good. Well, I'm glad. And I think it's mutual where I hear you say things that make me reflect on my own recovery process and the way I go about maneuvering things. So I think I love that it's very mutual in this space where we get to have these conversations and learn from one another. Uh, but I think before we hopped on this call and while we were kind of brainstorming what we wanted these conversations to look like, one of the topics that came up for us was the topic of binge eating. And from our conversations, we know that it is a part of both of our stories. And this is a part of my story that I haven't been incredibly vocal about, but I feel like it is a part of a lot of people's stories, not only with relation to an eating disorder, but once individuals enter into the space of recovery. And so, to start this part of the conversation off, I'm curious to know, what was your experience like with binge eating, in the course of, maybe potentially when you had your eating disorder or in the space of recovery?
Yeah, this is such a good question. And I do just want to insert a little disclaimer. There probably will be triggering terms or moments. So if you do feel triggered by any of this, I just encourage you not to listen. But I would say, honestly, I faced binging during the second half of my eating disorder, which I would say is kind of typical from what I've heard from a lot of people who have struggled with more restrictive eating disorders. So I actually had anorexia, but I was later diagnosed binge purge subtype, which a lot of people aren't familiar with that subtype, but it's essentially, I was anorexic. I struggled a lot with restriction just in general, like restricting my food intake, and also, I struggled some with over exercise, but I soon found that my body needed food. Like I just was craving it so much that I eventually, like 2.5 years into having an eating disorder, that second half of my eating disorder for the next 2.5 years was characterized by a lot of binging and purging. Um, at first, it didn't start off with binging, it was more of purging. But I think our bodies truly get to a space, or at least mine did, where it needed food. Like I was craving food like I had never craved it before. I was obsessing over food. I was thinking about it all the time. And I just, especially at nighttime, would have these incidences where I was binging on everything, everything. And I would have particularly desserts. Um, and because that was a big fear food of mine, it was a big food that I restricted. So, desserts or heavy carbs, heavy fats, things like that. Um, and so after these moments, though, the ED voice would tell me, you should feel extremely guilty. Like now you need to make up for it. And so often that would look like purging via, induced vomiting or via exercise. And so I just wanted to keep in mind, like, none of these behaviors were obviously healthy. My electrolytes were horrible. I had severe heart issues. My labs were really messed up. I know that's not the case for everyone, but for me, it was. And this is not a healthy or sustainable way of living. And yet I continued with it because, on the one hand, I had this fear of eating. And on the other hand, my body was craving food. And so for so long, I was just stuck in this cycle of restriction, binging, and purging. And finally, when I chose recovery, I remember having a mental breakdown. And I always tell people this when they're like, why did you choose recovery? I always talk about my mental breakdown, but I never mention that it was after a really tough night of binging and purging for hours. Just a continual, cycle. That's what it had turned into. I would binge and purge, and then I would binge again and purge again. And it feels icky talking about it because I remember those feelings of ickiness I felt in the moment, but I also was always the lowest I've ever been after those moments. And that's when I finally just like had a mental breakdown and called my mom and was like, I can't keep doing this. Like, I can't live in this cycle of restricting and binging and purging. Like, this is just not how I want to live. And so, all of that to say, I think going through that and going through all the different emotions that come with like restriction on the one hand, it feels so different than the feeling of binging, which feels so different than the feeling of purging. And I think just going through the cycle of all of those emotions for years, I was so fed up with it, and I was like, I'm ready to choose recovery. And so I would say that's kind of how my binging was related to my eating disorder. I didn't see as much binging after, committing to recovery. I wouldn't say that I binged. Did I overeat sometimes? Sure. But I was really focused on not binging intentionally in my recovery because I knew that that had triggered me to purge in the past. And so I, even to this day in my recovery, and am very, very careful about even overeating because I just get really uncomfortable with that feeling of nearing bingingness because it just kind of traumatizes me in a way. So I know that's not everyone's experience. That's just mine. And yeah, I hope I kind of conveyed that correctly and didn't wasn't too triggering for anyone as well.
Not at all. I want to thank you for sharing that part of your story. And as you were sharing, like found that that hit like a really tender spot in my heart, as I just mentioned that this is a part of my own recovery journey that I haven't been as open and honest about. I think I talk about it at a surface level, but hearing you share your own lived experience, it just like brought me back to when I was really struggling with binging. And I think you said it so beautifully and represented it so beautifully when you were talking about like when you are in that space of restriction. And while I was never diagnosed with an eating disorder, I was living with anorexia, self diagnosed, of course. But when you're in that space of restriction and you are in that space of, feeling the lowest of lows, right? Like it is a dark, dismal, gloomy place, right? And then when you get into that space of binging, it is like endorphins overload, right? Where it's like euphoric in a way, where your brain is like, oh my gosh, it's getting food. Like you haven't fed me in your body forever and ever. And so, like, it is so excited, right? Like when you're in those moments of a binge episode. And then, the aftermath, that's when the shame and guilt comes in. And then that's when you have those urges to, go back to restriction or purging. And, it's so interesting to hear you share your experience with binging during your eating when you were living with your eating disorder. My experience is actually when I was entering into the space of recovery. That's when I found myself in the space of really struggling with binging. And it my events of binging sounded quite similar to yours, in which I just got so excited, and typically it was a lot of those quote unquote fear foods or forbidden foods. And so for me, mine was also sweets. It was pizza, it was anything like that. um and I would just go over the top, like would feel so sick. um and then the next day I would just not eat. And it would be that cycle over and over. And then it was to the point where, like, physically, you could tell that I was binging, and because my body wasn't used to processing a lot of these foods. So, for example, like, I was very swollen, like my fingers like so swollen, my face swollen, pudgy. Like there are so many physical signs that like even looking back at pictures when I considered myself in recovery, but I was still trying to figure out how to quote unquote beat binge eating or, try to heal that part. Um, that it's like, wow, like I can tell those moments when I was binging, and it was the next day because it would just be like it's hard to recognize myself, to be honest. So it's just that's a large part of my experience with binging is entering into the space of recovery and recognizing that like I can't continue to do this. Like it's not good for my body to deprive it from the hours of whatever 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. and then binge 9 to midnight, right? Like, so my mind was like, you've got to figure this out. And for me, it was something had finally clicked in my head, was that, oh, well, if you just ate consistent full meals throughout the day, you wouldn't have this big urge to need to binge because you're constantly giving food to your body. Like it is such a simple concept, but and I'm curious to like enter into this space of the conversation now, but and I think it's the same with ED, and binge eating disorder is a really common eating disorder, but I think there is this fear of, not being able to have those binging episodes, right? Like once you kind of enter into that space of consistently feeding and fueling your body throughout the day, and I noticed some resistance in that space. So I'm curious to know, like, when you started working and entering into that space of recovery, what were your own thoughts and emotions around binging?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to be completely honest, I think to this day, I still have a fear of binging. And it's not a fear in the sense that I feel like I'll binge ever again. It's not that. It's just I associate binging so much with my disorder that anything near it just feels so just I don't know, even icky for me. It just reminds me of my eating disorder. And so I when I entered recovery though, like I really tried to do just some exploration about like, okay, what does it actually mean to binge versus what does it mean to overeat versus what does it mean to have extreme hunger? And because it's so, it's so gray and it's so messy. And I think people try to make it really black and white, but so much of what I learned in recovery is that often things aren't as black and white as we try to make them. So I think making that distinction for myself early on in recovery, and I mean month 1, I was like, okay, let's figure out what all this is, Tori. Let's try to get curious with what a binge actually is since I've been experiencing these for so long. And I noticed with my binges in the past that they often were during a time when I felt very out of control. I was using food as a means to just access control, and then I would use the purging after to get negative energy out of my body. It was very much a tool for numbing myself. Second, my intentions around food. I knew 99% of the time before I was eating something if my intention was to binge it. And so I think just being very self aware of my intentions around the meal. And then I guess third is just kind of like being a little bit more in tune with myself during the meal. I think that feeling of numbness in my brain that I would get during a binge was very, very apparent during that binge. It was very like, I am solely doing this exercise to numb myself and to allow myself to have all these foods that I haven't had previously. And so, like entering into the recovery space, I just tried to really think about okay, when I'm approaching these meals, I want to do things like with intention. Like if I'm going to overeat, I'm going to allow myself to overeat, but I want to do so with intention. Like maybe I want to overeat a little bit because I want a bit more extra ice cream or cake that night. And that's a very normal human thing to do. I think I just tried to kind of get away from the very emotionally charged eating that I associated with that binging. And that kind of allowed me to distinguish between, the binging and the just overeating. And then I always like to mention extreme hunger is like a third piece because I think extreme hunger plays a role in this just from the sense that, like, when you have been depriving your body for so long, you are in a deficit. Like, your body, your organs are in a deficit. And so, a lot of people are going to have these urges to eat a lot of food. And that is different than like the urge to binge. That is like the urge to binge is often to serve this emotionally charged purpose in your life. Whereas I see extreme hunger personally as your body's in such a deficit that it needs more food from you. And I think that's where you talked about, Eric. Like, that's why we feed our bodies consistently throughout the day. And maybe we eat more at the beginning of the recovery than we ever have in the past. And so, I don't know. I think just exploring all these different things of, binging versus extreme hunger versus feeling full or overly full was really helpful for me in my recovery.
Tori, that was so beautiful. And I feel like I could also bottle that up and take it with me and carry it with me for the rest of my life because, I am such a firm believer that, you know, words are so important and the words that we use can really create different meanings to things. And so I love how you said there's a clear difference between binging and overeating. There is. And I love that distinguishment you made between the two where it's binging is fulfilling an emotional need and overeating is fulfilling a physical need. That is brilliant. That is so brilliant. And that is something that I have not ever had the time to sit or think about. But I think for those that are listening that may be struggling with binge eating, this might be a really important piece of knowledge for them to take with them and help them on their journey.
Oh, I hope so. That makes me feel good. Yeah, and I think like from that, whenever I was approaching meals, typically at night, I would get a little bit more anxious about meals because that's when a binge would happen. I always kind of went into meals, whether that be meals that had more fear foods that I typically would have binged on in the past, or maybe meals around people where I would have binged in the past. I always try to go in before and say, like, tune into myself. Like, what do I need in this moment? And I think continually checking in with yourself during the meal can be really helpful for reducing binging, just because if you continually are checking in and making sure that your emotional needs are being met, then you just feel more like emotionally fulfilled. You don't need that binging to come in and make you feel emotionally fulfilled. You can provide that for yourself. And then the meal can, probably still be imperfect and messy because it's recovery, but it can be more of like a meeting your physical needs type of meal or enjoying the company type of meal. And so that's why when people ask me advice for preventing binges, I always say check in with yourself. Ask yourself, how do I feel and what do I need? I do that constantly, like even, day in and day out. I think that's a great life practice. Like, what do I feel and what do I need? And it's going to be different every time. It might be that you need to journal, you need to go outside, you need to step away from food for a second because it's just too much. So you'll return to it in 10, 15 minutes. It can be whatever it needs to be. And I think that's where a lot of the work of figuring out what works for you is helpful. But yeah, that practice has served me so much.
I agree with you 100%. And, I think what you're really hitting at here is this mind body connection that, when you enter into the space of recovery, that you're working on bridging the connection between those two. Because when you are living with ED, that's severed, and mind is one entity, body is another. And so, like, this is a really challenging skill to develop right away once you enter into the space of recovery, because you are most oftentimes so disconnected from the way your body feels. And it's easier, I would say, to figure out how you feel mentally and emotionally, but how do you connect how you feel up here to how that, shows up in your body? And so I love that you hit on that. And like, that is such a key integral skill for those that are in recovery, is paying attention to both body and mind. And when we can learn to trust both of those and have the ability to listen to both and create trust and a safe, loving relationship with both of them, it makes navigating these more difficult moments a little easier, I think.
I agree. And I think you even talked a little bit there about like the somatic experience part. And that's really where you're locating these emotions you're feeling in your body. And I use that still to this day, where, if I'm feeling anxious, that's true, but it's really part of you that's feeling anxious, and like we can locate where that anxiety is in our body. So often I feel anxiety here, like in it's tightness in my throat, maybe it's tightness in my chest. And so a lot of what somatic experience is locating where that anxiety is and then just allowing it to be, exploring it, maybe, doing some like side to side movements to really just like calm your nervous system and just like explore and allow and notice. And I think that's helped me a lot, not just in, preventing binges for sure, but just like I said, like the day-to-day tools we use in recovery to just allow ourselves to be and know that things are okay and that we're safe. Because I think that's what a lot of recovery is. At least for me, it's like I want to feel safe. And my ED made me feel safe for a really long time, even though it was a maladaptive form of feeling safe. And now I'm actually finding out what true safety is. And it is that connecting with yourself and understanding and talking yourself through these things and saying, like, I am safe, like everything is okay.
Yeah, 100%. And with that too, I think one thing that's been helpful for me is, I've also done some somatic work as well. And whenever I find myself, paying more attention to physical cues that my body is giving me, I approach them now with curiosity instead of judgment. Because I feel like when we immediately jump into the space of judgment, we get ourselves into this space of like black or white thinking, right? Where you've labeled this experience as that, right? And now it's bad because you're feeling this way. But I feel like when we approach it through the lens of curiosity, there's no judgment attached to that. You can like go up and walk around it and be like, I wonder why I'm feeling this, right? And when we can approach it from that way too, where, relating this back to, food and eating, when you sit down at a meal, you might notice that you are anxious, right? Okay, why might I feel anxious? Why do I feel the need to potentially overeat on this particular food? And approach it from curiosity. And when we get into that reflective process, that's the key. That is the key to help us maneuver the next moment a little easier and with intention.
Yeah, I love that. And hopefully it's okay if I ask you a question. So I'm wondering too, like I'm a big practical tip person. Like I remember especially when I first started recovery, I was like I just want someone to give me tips. Like if I am sitting here, I feel like I'm about to binge. I feel like something like that bad thing is going to happen. Like what do I do? Like what tips do you have for me to prevent this? Like what would you say from your perspective?
Yeah, and that's a really great question. I am such a firm believer in this concept of name it to tame it, where I feel like that emotional awareness or just awareness in general is so important to have, because once you have that awareness and you're noticing something going on, you are more likely to be able to name it. Once you are able to name, so like for example, if you're starting to feel anxious, then you might feel that a binge is coming on, right? Where you take the second to pause, explore these emotions instead of impulsively acting on whatever that instinct is, and having that curiosity to name it, right? Like, okay, I'm feeling anxious. What am I actually feeling anxious about, right? Like, oh, I'm feeling the urge to binge. Okay, great. I've named it. Once you've named it, I feel like you have that awareness and you kind of have better mental capacity to figure out the steps you need to take then. So I think once we enter into that space of naming, I think the steps that follow can just be more intentional and focused to kind of help you maneuver the situation.
I love that. I honestly don't have anything to add. I mean, it's like you said, it's really if you name it, you identify it and you identify that there's clearly like an emotional need that needs to be met. I think from there, you're in a lot more, you're kind of in your rational, wise mind. You know what I mean? Like the binge takes you to that irrational mind. And if you can name it and move it up to that rational mind, you're able to kind of decipher the next path a lot easier. I don't think there's like a one step, like, oh, leave the room or oh, call your mom. I don't think that it's as simple as that. You know, I think people are trying to be helpful by providing some alternative options to binging, which is great. But I think you really hit the nail on the head there when you said name it, become aware of it, enter that rational mind space and proceed cautiously and with intention. Like, I think that's beautiful.
Yes, and I think the way you reflected that back to me, like what comes to my mind and how I truly believe we should live life is we need to respond to the outside world from our heart and then move up. We cannot respond to the world solely through our mind and then expect ourselves to be able to drop into the body and live life in that space. So I think like how you reflected that back to me, that's where my brain went, was like, wow, if we can truly take the time to sit, allow an experience where it feels down in here, it's going to be a much more authentic space for us to move up into our mind and respond from that heart space and where we are feeling it in our bodies.
Yeah, I love that. Wow. We really could like take these little nuggets and bottle them up. I'm not lying.
Well, I'm just looking at the time here, and I think we are just going to be wrapping up our conversation here together today, Tori. But you know, I have so many different ideas for future conversations that we're going to be able to have with one another. But you know, to end our conversations with one another, I love being able to end with, you know, like what is one key takeaway or thing that you felt like you learned or were able to, you know, self-reflect upon in our conversation with one another today.
Love that. Okay, I think and you had so many like different little nuggets of wisdom, but I really like what you said about even at the way beginning, you were kind of talking about your wins and the fact that like sometimes our biggest wins also can be our biggest challenges and just allowing those two things to coexist. I think I've slowly tiptoed back into my black and white thinking a bit sometimes. And so I think that you just kind of gave me a really good reminder that like, two things can be true at the same time and we can exist in the gray. And even that last nugget of wisdom, I love what you said with starting to tune into your body first versus your mind and just like acknowledging that connection. Like it's not body and mind, it's body and mind working together. And so, yeah, just kind of all of that, like, just really hit me for sure. So that's what I'll be taking away.
That's awesome. And you know, I want to highlight here too, though, you know, like something that you had just said, you know, I actually took away from our first conversation that we had with one another when you had made this comment, and it still sticks with me and I use it with other people now. But you had said something along the lines of, it's often the things that set us back that help us move forward the most. And that, like, I use that language, and that was yours. That is something that you told me that I am now inserting into conversation with other people. So I want to reflect that back to you, as you were the one that taught me that um, in our last conversation with one another. But you know, I'm thinking about, you know, what I am taking away from this conversation, and I think for me, it's that distinguishment that you talked about between what is a binge versus what is overeating, and distinguishing the differences between the two, where binge is you're fulfilling an emotional need, and overeating is you're really meeting that physical need. And that really like profoundly stood out to me. So I thank you for sharing that with me today and with our audiences.
Yeah, no, hopefully that can be helpful to someone. I can't remember who told that to me, maybe a dietitian, maybe social media, but yeah, that's helped me so much since like day one of my recovery. I can't even tell you. It's just it takes away a lot of the shame when you allow yourself to open the space up to overeating as something that can exist in recovery.
Hmm. And we're humans at the end of the day. Like, we're gonna make mistakes. We're gonna, you know, feel like we're taking steps backwards. But like, that's just the nature of being a human being. And if any of those things happen, it doesn't make us any less of a worthy person, and it's just a part of life. And so I just invite listeners to offer themselves some self-compassion and grace as well, if they find themselves, you know, anywhere in their recovery journey or living with their eating disorders where they feel like they've made a mistake or messed up or have done anything that, you know, tells them that, and that it's okay. And make sure you continue to offer yourself that love, because it's what you and your body need, and it's what's going to help keep moving you forward throughout your journey.
And I think too, like what you said earlier about the curiosity versus judgment too, because I think I always say judgment and shame fuel the eating disorder, curiosity and kindness kill it. So I think if you just can keep that in mind when you are trying to prevent a binge or have gone through binging, just keeping those things in mind can be really helpful.
Absolutely. Well, Tori, I'm super excited that this conversation turned out the way that it did. And once again, I'm just so excited to be able to continue to have these conversations with you, because I feel like we see things so similarly within the space of EDs and recovery. And I love that it is very much so a reciprocal relationship where we are able to learn from one another. We're able to ask each other real and honest questions, because I feel like these are the conversations where we dig into the deep and personal stuff that not a lot of people have the chance to hear. And so I thank you for your vulnerability and for your time. And I look forward to the time that we are able to connect again very soon.
Thank you so much. I know I can't wait till next time, and happy Nita Week, everyone.
Once again, I would like to give a big thank you to Tori for being on today's episode and for sharing part of her story with us today. So, I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on our conversation, so please feel free to let me know and reach out. And also, if you have any topics that you would like for the two of us to cover in a future conversation that we have with one another. So, until next time, I hope you all continue to take care of yourselves. You remember to nourish both your body and your mind. And most importantly, I hope you continue to remind yourself of your innate worth and that you are worthy of your own love. Much love.